So hi and welcome to the preview launch of the About Vaccines website. I'm Maria Delaney, editor of Noteworthy, the investigative platform of the journal.ie, and I'm president of the Irish Science and Technology Journalists Association. And I'm delighted to help out with this launch, as tools to help tackle misinformation are crucial in today's online-driven world. And it's also of particular interest to me, given the journal's focus in tackling misinformation through its fact check unit. And I just noticed this morning it's very timely, with the largest sustained decline in childhood vaccinations in around 30 years reported from the World Health Organization and UNICEF, with misinformation mentioned as one of the contributing factors. And we're here today to hear about Dublin City University's Voices for Vaccine project. We have a brilliant panel coming up in a few minutes, and we also hear from a project participant as well as those involved in the project. And we have a few minutes for Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, please pop them into the box on your screen as we go along. And also, I just want to let you know that we're recording this session today, as it will be going up on the YouTube channel later. I've been asked to give a bit of background on the project before we kick off. It was funded by Science Foundation Ireland's Discover programme and partnered by the National College of Ireland, the Federation of Early Childhood Providers and Early Learning Educators. And additional project support was provided by the ADAPT Centre, DCU Language Services, the Ireland Hub of European Digital Media Observatory, the Celsius Research Group at DCU, NALA, which is the National Adult Literacy Association, iHealth Facts, and Professor Anthony Staines. The project was led by Dr. Eileen Cullity, Assistant Professor at DCU's School of Communications and Deputy Director of FUJO, which is DCU's Institute of Future Media, Democracy and Society. It was done in collaboration with Barbara Gormley, who will tell us about the project later. She's a researcher and lecturer in health and science and health communication at DCU, as well as Farda Sultan, who will speak about inclusive design toward the end of the session. She's a marketing and business computing lecturer and co-founder of Farda and Net, the company who designed the About Vaccines website. But before we jump into the panel discussion, I'd like to ask Barbara to give a quick overview of the project.
Thanks, Maria. The Voices for Vaccine project, we work directly with the public to inspire confidence in the science behind vaccines and counteract vaccine disinformation. So we know that having accurate and straightforward health information is essential to the success of vaccine uptakes amongst parents and in keeping ourselves and our community safe from vaccine preventable illnesses. So in collaboration with parents and guardians who are also early learning educators and outreach workers, the Voices for Vaccines project led to the development of the About Vaccine website, which we are launching today. The website aim is to provide simple and accurate health information materials to help parents in making the decision to vaccinate by sourcing accurate vaccine information and distinguishing it from false vaccine information. So these co-created health messages then counter common vaccine myths and promote recognition of evidence-based vaccine information. And these messages have been used to create the website and associated communications materials, and are aimed at parents, early learning educators and outreach workers, as well as health professionals.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Barbara. And we have a great lineup of speakers who will touch on issues such as vaccine information, vaccine hesitancy, and involvement of diverse groups in projects such as this. And they are Katrina Flood, Assistant Director of the Early Learning Initiative at the National College of Ireland, Professor Anthony Staines, who provided support on the project and is a Professor of Public Health at DCU, an epidemiologist and paediatrician, Dr. Lorraine Bourne, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Psychology at DCU, Dr. Kim Roberts, Usher Assistant Professor of Microbiology at Trinity College Dublin, and Dr. Kirsty Park, researcher at FOJO, which, as I said, is DCU's Institute for Future Media, Democracy and Society. So, as Barbara said, the Voices for Vaccine project was a collaboration between researchers and public participants from diverse groups, which resulted in the co-creation of the About Vaccines website and information materials. So, a quick question to you all. Is it important for the success of health information campaigns that projects include seldom heard and diverse participants? Kim, perhaps you can start. put you on the spot there.
Thank you for putting me on the spot there. I think absolutely it's really important to engage as many different diverse groups as possible, because the reasons why people are hesitant about vaccines are also diverse. And so we need to understand that to be able to overcome those fears and overcome the misinformation. And of course, the thing about vaccines is, yes, it protects the individual, but vaccines work at their best when they're protecting the whole community. So it's about engaging as many people as possible to take up the vaccines, so that everyone's protected, even those who might not be able to get vaccinated for one reason or another. So absolutely, it's so important to engage with as many different groups as possible.
And Katrina, again, the same question to you in terms of kind of getting more diverse groups participating.
Thank you. Yes. So in terms of diverse groups and kind of seldom heard voices, in my experience working in community development over the years, sometimes the word of mouth and sharing information, you know, with a trusted person who you feel has the information is sometimes listened to more than the official information. And I'm sure some of the other panels will lead to this, because I'm not the expert on it, but misinformation can be dressed up looking quite official. So it's really important that those voices are heard. So why do you know, who do you believe? Why do you believe them? What would make you believe, you know, more official information, or how can you identify that? So it's really important to hear that in the first vein. And then in terms of the participation of my own staff in the project, they are all local women who work or who are from Dublin's inner city. They are very aware of you know, their own personal networks, their community, how people think. So it's really important to hear their voices, but also because educators generally are kind of people who are viewed as being a trusted source of information. So very important to have them as part of the group for their own information, for their own feedback, but also to give the views of the communities that they are from, and also for them to be engaged and be very aware and be prepared for misinformation.
And Lorraine, you know, I suppose we mentioned engagement, and that there again, like how would, I suppose, you fit into the diverse voices and the seldom heard groups?
I think in addition to the really important, I think, observations that have already been made, so PPI, so patient and public involvement, listening to the voices of all our citizens are just crucial for this type of initiative, but for research and designing and understanding very effective health campaigns in general. And when we even look at some of the measures or the psychological measures that are used to tap into, you know, what's hesitancy around vaccines, how can we predict it, how can we intervene, what we find is that a lot of these measures don't tap into the concerns for diverse groups. So understanding diversity and the complexity of these concerns are just really important for us to be able to explain, predict, and intervene. So PPI is crucial.
Brilliant. And I suppose when we're talking about that kind of things, Kirsty, you look at the media. So like, how does all of that fit in?
I mean, something we definitely see within misinformation and the sort of media reaction is that there can be this narrative constructed sometimes that this is just a mainstream media thing, and that can be used as a way to really undermine a lot of vaccine-related information. And so I think it's really important from that perspective that it's offering something different, that isn't just somebody on the news is telling you what a scientist says, which of course is very important, but that it's also other voices, that it's also things that people are perhaps more likely to trust because it's what they relate to and what they engage with more.
Perfect. And Anthony, I suppose it's important, we're saying that the success of information campaigns like projects such as this include seldom heard and diverse participants. Like, what do you, how do you feel about that? I think we might be having some technical issues there, so we'll come back to Anthony on that in a minute. But Kirsty, just going back to you, you recently co-authored the Digital News Report Ireland 2022, which found that 58% of Irish consumers said that they were concerned about fake news or misinformation. And I know that one of the aims of the About Vaccines website is to be a source of accurate information about vaccines, but obviously not all online platforms have this aim, unfortunately. So can you tell us about how they could provide a fertile ground for vaccine information, and if this can be managed?
Sure. I mean, we definitely know from research that's been done already that there is a relationship between vaccine hesitancy and misinformation on social media. So that is a massive problem. And with the size of platforms too, it's extremely hard to manage. One of the concepts that's coming up a lot within misinformation research is called inoculation theory. And it's not actually anything to do with medicine itself. It's to do with the idea that if you sort of prime people with what to look for and help them to, as this project is doing, distinguish and identify the difference between accurate information and misinformation, it actually makes people much more well equipped to be able to then deal with it when they see it online.
Brilliant. And I suppose we're talking about accurate information there, but Lorraine, obviously vaccines have been spoken about more than ever with COVID, but even before the pandemic, vaccine hesitancy was a frequent discussion in health spheres, and people can be hesitant about or refuse vaccines for a number of reasons. And I suppose, can you delve a bit more into these reasons, and in particular, how people can become influenced by false vaccine information, such as Kirsty's mentioned there?
Yeah, Maria, the WHO's SAGE group, so their strategic advisory group, kind of pulled together some definitions around what hesitancy is. So the traditional focus is on kind of the outcomes, so that you delay or maybe you refuse to take a vaccine, and that could be on your behalf or maybe on your child's behalf, for example. But more recent definitions are focusing on kind of the psychological factors, you know, so what's that decisional conflict, you know, what are you weighing up? What are the concerns that you have and legitimately that you have? So in understanding what hesitancy is around vaccines, they kind of come up with the 5 C's, and when they look at what predicts hesitancy, very much being able to weigh up the pros and cons, and this is really linked to what, Kirsty, you've been talking about, this mis and disinformation, being able to weigh up, you know, like true and false information. This is coming out as really important. The other C is this idea of this collective responsibility, the social utility. So, you know, what are vaccines for, and this kind of social argument. And I know, Anthony, you'll be talking about this, but the confidence, trust is so important in the science, in the vaccines, and of course, in the very close kind of stakeholders in the other process. Complacency is another C. So around, you know, what is the risk of illness? You know, do we really need kind of vaccines? And then, of course, the convenience. So, you know, is it affordable? Are there any barriers to access? And what's interesting is when we talk about the role of false information, a lot of work has been done, you know, pre-COVID, just understanding how susceptible individuals can be and what are the psychological factors. So we have a lot there. I'm not going to drill down too much into it, but there is definitely an issue to do with how we process the information. And I really liked what you were talking about, Kirsty, this inoculation, like boosting psychological immunity. So either you debunk or you pre-bunk, so before, but you really need to understand the concerns, so those diverse and seldom heard voices as well, in terms of understanding what are vaccine concerns. So some really nice work by Daniel Salmon in Baltimore has talked about kind of parental concern, in particular first time pregnant mothers, females. And, you know, around this, it's a teachable moment, understanding their concerns, and then how can you intervene? So be it pre-bunking or debunking.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that there, because I know there was concerns last year in terms of pregnancy and COVID vaccines, and there is, I suppose, things about communication and healthcare workers and things like that. Which brings me nicely to you, Anthony, in terms of like during the pandemic, we often turned to healthcare workers, including doctors such as you and nurses, pharmacists and others, to help explain issues and improve our understanding of vaccines. So like you are usually viewed as trusted sources, healthcare workers, and how does this trust fit into effective vaccine communication?
I think trust is very important, and it's very specific. So we look at the communities in Ireland that are relatively poorly vaccinated. They tend to be communities that are less connected to wider social networks than perhaps the majority of the population. We trust because we earn it. We get trust because we convey the messages, but sometimes the messages we have to convey are complicated. I mean, when the vaccines came out, we had clinical trial results which showed two things. One was that they reduced substantially serious illness, and the other is in fairly large numbers of people, in tens of thousands of people, that they seemed pretty safe. And it's taken quite a while to understand more fully what are the risks of vaccination, how do they compare with the risks of infection. And it turns out the risks of infection are far higher than the risks of vaccination. But what's been a really complicated message to get across, and I'm not sure we've managed it yet, is that unlike many of the vaccines people are familiar with, COVID vaccines don't give you immunity from further infections. And that's been the real challenge. That's been the real difficulty. It's been difficult to establish that precisely. And it's hard to explain it because it's a different message from most of the other messages we give out. And there are other vaccines. I mean, tetanus is the most famous one, where you have to have regular boosters. You know, we know the immunity from tetanus wears off in 8 to 10 years. And if you work in the right kind of jobs, or if you have an injury, you have to have a tetanus shot every so often. But for COVID, it looks like you have to have a booster maybe twice a year. We don't really know yet. So it's more like flu vaccine, where we know you have to get a flu shot every year. And it's a new territory for us. And it's territory that many of us don't fully understand, because it's hard to keep up with the evidence as it emerges. It's hard to make sense of the evidence as it emerges. So earning the trust of the public involves being open to the uncertainties, being able to say, yeah, well, we know this, we think this, and we don't know that. And it's a more nuanced message than some of the other messages we are able to put across. And that's been a real challenge in COVID communications.
Yeah, and Lorraine, I might actually just pop back to you on that, because I suppose Anthony mentioned there in terms of just the challenges faced and in the kind of the last few years. And like you did mention that some of the processes that happen in terms of false vaccine information, like maybe you can talk about, like, I suppose in light of that, like what can be done to make information stick, and how projects such as Voices for Vaccine fit into that.
Marie, I think that there's a lot that this project, I think, is adding to in terms of understanding the factors that play, the mechanisms, and to especially with understanding parental concern, how we can move forward. I think in mapping what some of the thinking or the cognitive factors are to how can we better communicate or mount our health information campaigns. One is to do with how a fact is repeated. So if something is repeated lots and lots of times, it has this illusion of truth, illusory truth. So in debunking, in a way that can be used to debunk so false information. So where a fact is clearly established, and of course that includes, like Anthony said, the parameters around what's known and unknown. The myth is also established but not repeated. And then any of the manipulation techniques that are used are exposed, like in the prior, and this project helps understand where have you come across these types of communique and what techniques are used. And then the fact is repeated again, and they correct in a way information is emphasized. So in a way it's playing into how one processes information, how it can be memorable, and how it can link to your attitude and attitudinal change and persuasion. So there are ways, of course, to look at how, in terms of your thinking, you can debunk or pre-bunk So it's a debiasing. It's used in lots of intelligence analysis and here in understanding health information. I do think health literacy is very important. So projects like this project really inform how we understand and how we can support health literacy for all our citizens. I think it's just really important in understanding trust, as Anthony has said, within the healthcare system, how you establish, maintain trust, and also looking at the other attitude and biases that are operating that might render someone susceptible to false information, be it in terms of vaccines or other types of health information. So what are the alternatives? And instead of ignoring it, looking at it and actively debunking it. So those would be maybe some of the techniques, Maria.
Perfect. And I suppose you mentioned there about concerns, and I suppose parents obviously are a key group. And Katrina, like the Early Learning Initiative at NCI partnered with the Voices for Vaccine project. So what drove you to get involved, and why do you think it's important to involve early learning educators in these types of discussions?
Yeah, so we run 2 different home visiting programs. So one of them is has a kind of a infant mental health, child development focus, and it's based on the old HSC Community Mothers program. And the other one is more focused on, it's more of an intervention program and focuses on language acquisition and parent-child bond. But for both home visiting programs, obviously for the old Community Mothers, the version of the Community Mothers program, the staff have a role to play in communicating important information. They would use the HSC My Child booklets as a guide. So, and while they are not there as experts, they're there as trusted visitors in the family home. And it's really important that these home visitors, all the families, they get referred onto the program from various different sources. They can self-refer, but also that the participation is voluntary. So there's no onus on the family to participate in this program. So that makes the relationship very good between the home visitor and the parent. And then for the 0 to 2 program that we run, which is the old Community Mothers program, it is important to have that information. It relates to your child, a parent's questions and queries in relation to their child and themselves and their family. And it's something that's more naturally going to come up. So for us, it was very important for our staff to know the correct information. And while they are not experts in fields of health, they are there to kind of support the parent to access the correct information, to refer them to reliable sources. And then also, if you're concerned, would you, a gentle encouragement, would you speak to your GP or would you speak to your public health nurse? So that's a really important role that they play. And, for these more emotive topics, and there's a lot of sensitive topics, obviously, in that 0 to 2 years or the prenatal to 2 and up that parents come up with. The home visitors have a very, there's a very important skill with connecting with parents, being able to give this information without getting kind of contentious or emotive, and then being able to say, well, this is the information and we can discuss it more, or, you can talk to another professional about it as well, that kind of encouragement piece. And then for our other home visiting program, while it might not come up as naturally because it's not part of the curriculum, it still comes up and parents trust their home visitor. So it's really important for the home visitor to be equipped and be aware and to know the right information and feel confident in their role that they can give the correct information to families.
Brilliant. And Anthony, I might bring you back in there because obviously Katrina mentioned trust there, and you were talking about trust in healthcare professionals. I was just wondering how healthcare professionals can help vaccine hesitant parents in particular make decisions and choices, and maybe how a website such as the About Vaccines website might fit into that.
I think we could help people by being honest and being very clear. One of the difficulties is there's a small number of people who have medical and nursing qualifications who are very opposed to vaccination, and not for any good reason. But it's very hard for the general public to understand that this group are a fringe minority in the business. So it really is about emphasizing why we think this stuff works, what things were like before we had vaccinations, what things could yet be like again if vaccinations stop working. how we can use vaccinations, really change people's lives, change communities' lives. And being very honest about it, because we have to be honest about what we know and what we don't know. But what we know about vaccines is a very positive story. But we have to be careful, because we can't claim that what we do is entirely safe, because it isn't. But it's much less dangerous than allowing the wild infections to occur. Measles vaccination is known to cause complications, but measles causes the same complications at a far higher rate than measles vaccination. And without vaccination, almost every child will get measles. And that's the argument for measles vaccination in a nutshell. Polio vaccination protects against a virus which causes paralysis in about 1% of.
We're having a few audio issues with Anthony, I think. I might just bring in Kim there. Kim, kind of what Anthony touched on, like there's a lot of conflict in information, or even as he's saying with healthcare professionals. Oh, sorry, Anthony's sorry, Anthony, you broke off there. If you want to finish your point, sorry.
Yeah, we can point to great achievements. We've eradicated smallpox. We're close to eradicating polio. That will change the lives of children all over the planet if we can pull it off. So that there's a bright future for vaccination, and we can show it to people. We can show the advantages to people.
Yeah, and I suppose one key group then in that kind of to prevent this kind of conflict information is scientists. So Kim, like Barbara was telling me about some of the results of the project earlier, and she mentioned that parents who participated described difficulties in evaluating the science behind vaccines and deciding which information is accurate and trustworthy, which is one of the reasons that the About Vaccines website was developed. And I was just wondering, what role do scientists play in combating false information about vaccines?
I think you're absolutely right in that it is very difficult to assess the information and whether or not that's information from a particular vaccine campaign, or as the unusual circumstances that we find ourselves in the last couple of years, where clinical trial data is being discussed in the general media, which has not happened before, and certainly not the day that the results come out, that it comes into the general media and you have lots of different voices commenting on it. And often when that was taking place, it wasn't presented within the context of what was expected, what's realistic, how does this data relate to similar trials with other vaccines, for example. And so without that background, the information just becomes noise. So I think it's really important for scientists to clearly communicate the developments that are taking place in a jargon-free way that people can access and that people can understand. And this is getting harder. The original vaccines, early vaccines, were much more simple to explain. You take a virus, you kill it, you inject it into somebody, your body can see that vaccine and respond to it. That's a fairly straightforward message. Got much more complicated with the current SARS coronavirus vaccines, where you're talking about, okay, so we have this virus that's come from a chimpanzee, and we've taken a gene from the virus that we're interested in, and we've put it in there, and that's going to present it to your body. That's harder. That's getting into the realms of much more complex science, but also the realms of science fiction. And of course, again, none of this is new. These similar kind of concerns were there with the smallpox vaccination of you take a virus from a cow and you inoculate it into people and they generate a response. And it's like, but why do I want a cow virus? And similar things with the adeno chimpanzee vaccines. And of course, as we move further with second, third generation coronavirus vaccines, the jargon is again getting more futuristic. We're talking about nanoparticles, nanoarrays, poly presentation. Those are phrases, those are words that conjure up images in our minds that are not necessarily helpful and can incite fear. So it's about communicating that technology, engaging people in the excitement of those technologies in a way that makes it accessible to people. And it's a nuanced conversation, and that's one of the difficulties. You've got to keep people's interest and people's engagement with it to be able to get across the grey areas, the times where there are risks. But as Professor Staines was saying, the risks of infection are greater. So it's not these are not straightforward messages to get across to people. And sometimes it's about balancing with journalists and with other people when you're trying to get this information across, that you need a bit of time, you need a bit of space so that the information is clear. And that's how you build trust. And also, I think that scientists, or when people are speaking in a public domain, there's a perception that we need to be absolute, we need to be certain, we need to be sure that this is a fact. And, you know, as previously said, I think we have to get comfortable with the grey areas, and we have to get comfortable in, yeah, this is what we said 2 years ago, and then the technology has moved on, and now we have this, and so we need to bring you with us with that, with the evolution of how the vaccines are working too.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Kim. And Anthony, I know you want to come in there, and there's also a question that you might answer when you come in about, do you think all healthcare professionals have the scientific knowledge of how vaccines work to be able to have effective conversations with patients and parents, etc.? And just a reminder to everyone that if you want to put some questions in the Q&A box, feel free to do that.
I mean, very briefly, some of the early anti-smallpox propaganda from the days when vaccination was first introduced showed small children with cow horns growing out of their heads. And smallpox was not adopted by engaging with that argument. It was adopted by saying, you know, this is what it does. You look around, every young woman has smallpox scars, every young man has smallpox scars. We can stop this. That's how it was dealt with, rather than engaging directly with whatever it was the anti-vaxxers of the time came up with. In terms of the questions the question that was asked, I think the answer is probably no. This stuff is very technical and very detailed. I mean, I know the clinical trials in this area fairly well because that's my job, but I have to take the molecular biology on faith. And I talk to my molecular biology colleagues to explain to me what's going on. And part of it is about explaining to healthcare workers who may not have a strong background in trial analysis or biology or cell biology, but explaining in ways that make sense to them as to what actually matters. So it is about getting message out there, getting consistent, clear, honest messages out there. And you put your finger in it, I think, when you said it was about acknowledging uncertainties. You know, we know some stuff about this vaccine. We don't know others, and explaining that to healthcare professionals so they can convey that information to other people they deal with, without either frightening them or confusing them, is tricky. But the healthcare professionals usually have enough of a common intellectual background, a common understanding of what's going on, that you can explain it to them. And explaining this to journalists, often over a period of time, is critically important. You can teach journalists a lot about clinical trials, but they don't come out of journalism school knowing it. You know, just like anyone else, they have to learn it over a period of time. And it is repetition of messages, clear messages, but honest messages are central to communication, both with the public, with the media, and with health professionals.
Brilliant, thanks, Anthony. And the media and journalists were mentioned a lot in the last few responses. So, Kirsty, I might bring you back in just to just to talk about like how the media has a role, I suppose, in it, or like how even scientists and healthcare professionals communicate to them, but also in terms of like getting information to diverse groups and seldom heard voices, or people perhaps without the scientific knowledge to back up some of the information that Kim was talking about there.
Yeah, and I have to say, I think this is an area that Ireland has done very well on compared to some other countries, in that there was a very unified approach within the news media, particularly during the early stages of the pandemic when we had the sort of daily briefings and everything. I know there was a lot of work together between journalists to make sure that that information was being distributed well. And so there's definitely a really important aspect of that, which is the mainstream media and news organizations taking a role in taking the responsibility and doing that, which I think we've certainly seen. But the thing is too that there are a lot of people who perhaps just aren't interested in news, don't engage with news, maybe have a lack of trust in news. And I think that's where we have to have multiple points of communication too, that it's not enough to just rely on one. And I think too, something that's kind of useful to remember is that when it comes to a lot of what's being shared on social media, it's often by people who are actually well-intentioned. They are concerned about their health or their family's health. They do have questions that they perhaps feel are unanswered. And obviously the way that they're going about it is a bit counterproductive at times. But I think that that's something important to remember, that there is I suppose, thirst for knowledge and thirst for understanding about what's going on with vaccines, so that people can feel empowered to make those decisions correctly.
And Kim, I suppose bringing you back in terms of reaching diverse and seldom heard voices, like how do scientists have a role in that in terms of accurate vaccine information?
I think it's encouraging scientists to have the courage to engage with a wide variety of different voices. As scientists, we're not trained in communication. It is part of our job, but it's not, and it's expected, but we're not trained in that sort of way. And it takes some courage to stand in that grey area and say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. And communicating it in different ways by different people are important, because different voices are going to be heard better by different groups. And of course, it is about engaging with as many different platforms as possible. So whether or not that is the mainstream media or it is social media, whether it's going into classrooms or going into parent groups, it's about scientists making themselves available to engage with people, to speak to people who want to communicate, and having the courage to communicate with people who don't agree with you. And that's one of the things. We can set up seminars, and the people setting up, we can set up presentations, set up seminars, and the people who turn up are the people who already agree with you to a large extent. And that's great. We can have that evolution of information and add more information, but it's not bringing everybody together. And it does take courage to put yourself into a situation where at times it can be quite heated, quite, can feel attacked. But as we've been saying, it's people who are generally wanting to make the best decisions for their family, and they've been receiving a lot of information, some misinformation, and they're trying to understand how they can navigate all of that information together. And so I think we have to be a bit humble with that, and not be the expert, not be the sage on the stage, but just be a person to a person sharing information. It's not easy, but I think the more scientists that are willing to engage in this way, the better things will be.
And I suppose we're speaking a huge amount here about diverse groups and seldom heard voices. I might just bring you in, Katrina, because you're probably closest to people on the ground in terms of early learning educators, and obviously they'd have a lot of contact with parents. Like how do you feel, I suppose, the work of early learning educators? Like, have you seen people engage in terms of vaccine misinformation, or try and help in that way?
Yeah, so the community that we would serve in the inner city, like it's a very diverse population, particularly around the Dublin 1 area. Some of it is quite transient as well. So obviously there's a lot of very old communities there as well, but some of it is quite transient. So there is that concern as well when people are more transient with their dropping in and out of areas and they may not have the right contact and the right information. We would, in terms of the staff, one of the things that they would be most, would want the most really is to feel confident in being able to communicate with this. And I think what Kim was saying there is really important, is being confident if you come up against somebody who has questions or has a different perspective. It's important to have a healthy conversation with them and be able to do it and maintain that relationship, because it's a very important relationship that, you know, very trusted relationship that our home visitors have with families. Now, in terms of, I'm not aware of specific examples in terms of vaccine hesitancy, but I know on our own team, there was a lot of conversation about it at the start. There was a lot of, you know, we were obviously communicating about it from a National College of Ireland perspective. We obviously were following all the guidelines and all that kind of stuff within across the pandemic. So it's kind of really important to have that modeling piece so that the staff can see what everybody else is doing and feel safe that they can have conversations. And I did have conversations with individual staff, you know, where they were not sure themselves about different stuff. So, and that's having that healthy space to be able to have the communication, because the concern is for seldom heard voices is if you have a different view or you're not sure in a very emotive topic like this, if you shut down that communication, you're never going to be able to communicate directly with that person. They're just going to shut down and walk away, and right, we won't discuss that ever again, and I won't listen. So that's the concern. But yeah, for me, it's as a manager of the staff, it's important that they feel confident, that they're aware, that they're able to have open and honest conversations amongst our team and engage in the content, and then that's modeled and they feel safe then to be able to do that with parents when questions come up. And they do, I mean, obviously, if you look at the My Child books and our 0 to 2 program, there's a lot of content there that touches on sensitive topics of, you know, vaccine schedules. You're talking about infant mental health, you're talking about parental bonding. So there's an awful lot of kind of sensitive material that goes on there. So it really does take a skill to be able to do that piece, as Kim was saying. You know, it takes a bit of bravery, or, you know, to be able to have that skill as well, to be very sensitive around another person's views, but also ensure that you communicate the accurate information and guide them towards areas that are accurate as well.
Thanks, Katrina. And I'm going to put everyone on the spot before we finish. I might start with you, Anthony, in terms of, I'm just going to ask everyone like what their top the most important thing that their sector can do to improve information around vaccines. So Anthony, I might just start with you.
I think make the information available. A lot of the information is only available in very obscure websites or behind journal paywalls. So as a very first step, we should be making information from vaccine trials much more widely and much more readily available than it is at the moment.
And Kim, what would your most important point be?
I think for me, it's about encouraging other scientists to engage with people and to be willing to answer questions. If somebody reaches out with a question, then I see that as fantastic. Even if it's a question that is following on from misinformation, you want to engage with that person because they're asking questions, they're interested. So I think there's a balance for scientists between communicating well and getting the information across without becoming a personality in social media or whatever that then can cloud that trust. And it's a fine line. And I think scientists engaging with those activities is fundamental, but in a cautious and trustworthy way.
Thanks, Kim. And Lorraine, what would your point be?
I think it would be to increase our effort to really understand the psychological, attitudinal barriers around hesitancy and reframe that messaging and be very clear on the messaging, but also the groups to which that there isn't this one message for everyone always. And as Kim said, and Katrina, communication is two-way, it's not top-down one way. And for all of these kind of important factors to play a part.
And Kirsty, in terms of the media, like what would the most important focus be?
I think it's important to be keeping aware and keeping up with what are the myths out there, what are people's current concerns, what perhaps things are spreading around on social media that might be influencing somebody to be hesitant about taking a vaccine, because that allows you to make responses which are, again, either pre-bunking or debunking, that you're able to actually address those things. We can see that through the work of fact checks, particularly with the journal. But there can be other work too, even just highlighting, making articles that show people or indicate to people what they should be looking out for, or how to recognize that something is fake or is a hoax.
Brilliant. And Katrina, in terms of early learning educators?
For me, I think it would be ensuring the staff feel confident to both communicate the information and how to communicate it. And as Lorraine was saying there, it's really important that there's an open kind of communication stream, so that we're modeling that as you know, management on the team, that staff are able to have open and honest communication, or you know, if they've got concerns, they're able to discuss it, rather than kind of shutting it down and saying, right, well, I'm not going to discuss that. So being open and honest. And then also for the staff is just having empathy when they're going into family homes, and they do anyway, but I think around a very emotive topic that people feel can be very polarized over, just having empathy for the family and where they're coming from. And as other panel members have said, you know, families, 99.9% of parents want the best for their child. Sometimes they just need support and need to ask the right questions, and have the right people give them the right answers to support them.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Katrina. And we'll be having more time for Q&A at the very end of the session. So continue to put your questions in the question box and we'll come to them at the end. But that's all we have time for from the panel. But thanks so much to DCU's Professor Anthony Staines, Dr. Lorraine Bourne, and Dr. Kirsty Park, as well as NCI's Katrina Flood and Trinity's Dr. Kim Roberts. And we're joined again now by DCU's Barbara Gormley to tell us more about the project.
Hi, yeah. So I just wanted to go over, do I share screen here, Anne? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to go over what informed the messages and how on the About Vaccine website, and how the information that we took from parent participants who were also early learning educators and outreach workers, how we took that information and we co-created messages with them, and those messages then were translated into information materials, etc. So some of the results, listen to our panelists speak and kind of answered the questions that some of the panelists asked about vaccine hesitancy, and indeed Katrina spoke about, you know, the early learning outreach workers having very strong relationships with you know, parents, etc., that they work with. So we'll just move on to the next slides. Thanks. So the project overview, as we said, we developed, collaboratively developed with public participants, which were parents, early learning educators and outreach workers, who were also parents or guardians. The outputs included co-created messages that counter vaccine myths and untruths, and also very importantly, to promote recognition of science, factual-based information. So these messages were then translated into campaign materials, and they resulted in the development of the About Vaccines website, which my colleague Farda Sultan will be showcasing today. We'll just go on to the next slide. So the methodology was focus group methodology, and the whole process was totally anonymized because we used collaborators. So we went through basically the National College of Ireland and the Federation of Early Childcare Providers. So the focus group's questions that were asked were based on an extensive review of the literature and WHO best practice, and addressing, and I know my colleague Lorraine Bourne went into a bit more detail, the 3 C's, which is reasons for vaccine hesitancy, and they have complacency, where people perceive the risk of vaccine preventable diseases as low. Convenience is about whether or not people can actually get access to the vaccines, or they want to. Sometimes it can do. It can be a lot around something is more important, life concerns, etc., than vaccination. Confidence, it refers to those having confidence and trust in those who deliver vaccine programs. So participants in the focus groups were also shown sources of accurate vaccine information, and we directed them towards certain parts of the HSE website, especially around areas like vaccine safety, and they gave us their views then on the information. So our findings. Next slide. So we asked our participants about their own attitudes to childhood vaccines, and all participants professed that they had their child vaccinated, but they did have fears and questions and concerns around vaccines. So participants from other countries described vaccination as something that happens from generation to generation in the country, something that's quite normal, something that they do. Older participants that maybe were guardians or grandparents and parents state that they would do as a doctor advised and vaccinate from fear, as they want to protect their children and their grandchildren. And in relation to vaccine schedule, older participants felt there was too many compared to their generation when they were first-time parents, and they specifically talk about the 6-in-1 vaccine approach being far too much. Next slide. So then we asked our participants their own attitude, I'll continue with their own attitude toward childhood vaccines. And we have younger parents, participants were very pro-vaccination. And this was based on good advice, real and personal story of the consequences of not vaccinating, and good information sourcing. So all participants had discussion with their family, friends, and grandparents about vaccinations and whether they should or shouldn't vaccinate their children. Next slide. So we then asked our participants about parents' attitudes that they work with to vaccination and how they addressed childhood vaccination conversations. And I know that Katrina touched on this and talked about the fact that, you know, they would have conversations. They would ask, are they following vaccine schedule, etc. They also have very trusted relationships. And this is very much the same for the early learning educators. So all had some experience in the role of parents who chosen not to vaccinate or continue to be vaccinated based on the direct effects of the vaccines. So we know, like, if the child was out of sorts or had a lump or a rash, etc., their social situation affecting adherence to the schedule, believing strong in vaccine myths about MMR and autism, and or being parents of children with autism who were vaccinated. So they were very empathetic, to answer Katrina's question, with parents who are vaccine hesitant. They don't judge or counsel, but listen and understand their fears. So we asked our participants then their opinions on current sources of information. This is where we asked them to look at the HSD website, etc. And they described the language as scary, but it would compel you to vaccinate to protect your child. So overall, they said it was very clear and understandable, but it's too lengthy and there's no explanatory diagrams. And there's quite a time commitment involved in getting through a lot of the information there. So then we asked our participants about their own experience of vaccination services, and they did tell us that they thought the vaccination services were excellent and continued to be so, especially during the COVID-19 period when lockdowns, etc., even when this research was done. So all described their experience of having their own children vaccinated and vaccinating visits as extremely daunting and highly emotional, especially for first-time parents. And their experience of vaccination services is very much dependent on who's administering that vaccine, so the healthcare professional, and how they explain the process of vaccination, such as the content and ingredients of vaccines, and why the child needs a vaccine at that particular time, etc. So we asked we asked our participants about their own and parents' fears and issues around childhood vaccinations. And they talk about vaccine safety, and they want to know the chemical composition and why the vaccine is given at that particular time. Vaccinating children with existing underlying illnesses, they had very big concerns about that. Vaccine schedule, they described their parents abandoning the schedule to give their children a break. And I think this is very poignant that they say this is at the 12-month vaccination with where the onset of autism, that they find a lot of parents breaking the vaccine schedule. So direct side effect of the vaccine, so the child being kind of out of sorts, rash, illness and lumps, etc. The spreading of false information around autism and MMR, having vaccines administered individually due to worry, because they feel that the vaccine schedule is a little bit heavy in their own words, and barriers to information. I know Lorraine touched on this, such as literacy, dyslexia, and English not being a first language. So they say that parents get a lot of their information, go-to sources for vaccination from social media and WhatsApp parent groups, etc., and websites. And they also worry about conflicts of information and so much information being out there. Conflicts of information as well from friends and family. in other countries if they're originally from another country, and also a very poor relationship with their healthcare professional. So we asked them then, and I know somebody touched on this as well, and I think it was Anthony, about trust and who influences their decisions to vaccinate. So they described the healthcare professional, and in particular, a really good GP who will remind them of their vaccination schedule and answer the questions and concerns. Local pharmacists who will remind them of their vaccine schedule again and address their questions and concerns with patients. And importantly, peer groups, individual or group, family and friends. So all participants have described experience of family or friends who are very vaccine hesitant, feel very strongly negatively towards vaccines, who try to influence their decision to vaccinate and refuse to take their positive advice on vaccines on board. So 2 participants had negative attitudes to vaccinations until they had their own children and sourced vaccine information from a trusted GP, family member or pharmacist. So some participants also had direct experience of children in the community or friends and family being impacted by not vaccinating. So then we come across what are the solutions, and we asked our early learning educators and outreach workers, our parents, what they thought would be solutions for information, and what they thought, how they wanted that information packaged and delivered, etc. So they said they wanted clear and concise information, which I know that Anthony has mentioned. Give the facts simply, answer questions and concerns, don't overload with information. They asked for early intervention at antenatal appointments, 1 information leaflet as new parents are busy, positive information and real life stories that they can relate to, explanatory diagrams, infographics, etc., multilingual information for those whose English is not their first language, and direction towards, and I know Anthony mentioned this as well, and Kim, direction towards the accurate science information and endorsement by real and trusted sources. So I'm now going to hand back to Maria, and she will hand over to my colleague Farda Sultan, and we'll discuss the findings. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barbara. So Farda Sultan, whose company Far and Net designed the website, is going to give us a quick overview.
Good morning, and thank you for that. So really, what I would like to do is give you a bit of a kind of rationale and the background and kind of the thinking behind design in terms of the material that I was privileged to produce, and also the website. So really I was involved with Eileen and Barbara in the project for over a year while the project was taking place in terms of the focus groups, because I was very much, I wanted to understand the rationale, the thinking behind the project, thinking of the need of the participants, and I really wanted to kind of immerse myself into that. And I also managed to read extensively on the existing material, the websites, and so on, and to step back and examine this kind of from the objective point of view as a researcher, as a designer, but also as a parent. So in collaboration with Eileen and Barbara, we then decided to name to give a name to the website, to keep it simple as well. So we decided About Vaccine really sums it up beautifully, because it's the website about the vaccines. And then the tagline that, when we were discussing it, it just came naturally. So when I was trying to kind of confirm my thinking, what it is that they're trying to achieve. So it's, when I kind of reported back and trying to clarify my thinking, was that I asked Barbara and Eileen, is it you wish to provide information about a vaccine in a plain, accurate and simple language? Is that it? And that naturally became a tagline for that. So what I'll do, I'll quickly share my browser, where I have a number of files open. So as you can see here, as a result of this, we've decided, I've developed this logo, which is the discussion point. So you have this kind of conversation bubbles, and then a tagline, plain, simple and accurate information about vaccine in aboutvaccines.org. And really what I wanted to do from the start was, as a visual communicator, to translate these lengthy documents, lengthy information into kind of concise, visually appealing imagery. I was very much also worried about some of the colors that I could see on the existing websites and the information material, and having the background in cyber psychology and psychology of design, I wanted to steer away from some of the colors such as red and black and yellow, which we are really in society almost kind of we are trained to think as warning colors. So I wanted to focus on positive colors, but also the colors that are more inclusive in terms of the people who suffer cognitive impairment, dyslexia. Stay away from bright whites, blacks, and so on, and really kind of to focus on inclusivity in terms of the fonts that we're using, being sans serif fonts, which are much easier to read, and some more serif fonts, which are more elaborate. And then also focus on the kind of inclusive imagery. So what I'll do, I'll just share here. So for instance, some of the documents I've read was this beautifully produced, but I have to say very lengthy immunization document from HSC. And you can tell here, there are 64 pages, and it goes into very lengthy information about the vaccine, what it does, what it's supposed to do, and everything. And I think this is one of the things that maybe parents felt was overwhelming as well. So I thought, how would I translate this both for early learning educators but also for healthcare professionals when they're dealing with people who might not be proficient in English as well, but also who might not have a high health literacy background. So so I came up with something hopefully kind of more simple. And I hope you can see the entire screen here. So first of all, because HSC document was very much focused on that, encouraging parents that there are 5 immunization stages. I thought, well, let's use the hand 5, and that way we can, the professionals and the learning educators could use their own hand, which can then be understood. And we say, well, the first immunization visit is at 2 months, then it's a 4 months, and so on. And that way you can describe the stages. But I also wanted to focus as Dr. Anthony mentioned there, on the protection as opposed to what the illnesses. So really the point of the vaccination is to protect the children. So it's protect your child. And as parents, what has emerged also from research is that, most of you, as many panelists have mentioned here, parents want to protect their child. So really kind of emphasizing this language of protection, and saying that it's a free vaccine, because again, some of the parents, they bring the knowledge from their home countries if they're not from Ireland, or they might not be aware if they don't have their GP that this is a free vaccination service. It's a free service offered to all of the children in Ireland. And again, focusing on the language it is using, doctor, not only GP, because I think GPs, for us living in Ireland long term, such as myself and people who are, like many of you are born here, GP, you know what GP means. It's but for someone who is newly arrived to Ireland, they might not be aware that it's a general practitioner. It's a doctor. So it's very much. And then these are the kind of, this is a kind of the starting point of a conversation, and then building on that. And this was specifically designed for healthcare workers. And then I thought, well, how we can assist the parents to work on this, organize this in a kind of easy way. And I thought, well, let's produce an infographic chart that they can stick ideally on the fridge or somewhere where it's accessible for them. And then use the same notion of the hand at 2 months, 4 months, but also to mention here its due date, and then kind of once that vaccination has been done, it's kind of, there is a small nudge of a tick that they tick, it's done. And again, they have the name, date of birth, doctor's name, and doctor's telephone number, so that they have information, all the information that they need there, so that they, so let's say they're preparing a dinner and they say, oh God, I haven't, vaccinated, the vaccination is due. While I'm making this, I'll quickly take a mobile and ring the doctor and make an appointment. So it's, that was the kind of rationale behind it. And then there are other charts that are part of in the website as well. It's conversation guide for healthcare workers. So it's starting with the assumption that the parents would vaccinate, answer any queries, obtain the parent consent, and then administer recommended dose. And then, but if parent is not ready to vaccinate, then you go into second stage and so on. So it's very kind of self-explanatory. And then touching on 3 C's of complacency, confidence, and convenience that was mentioned by Barbara and some of you in the panel there, that there is this lack of trust and confidence. But also it's important to have, one of the reasons is convenience, because there might some of the participants might be hindered by transport or assumed affordability and so on. So those are a range of materials that are part of the website. So going back to the actual website, the website itself was, and here is the live website. So it's professionally, it's coded, purposely coded. It's not a template design. So every piece of the website that you see, it has been specifically designed and coded for this project. And again, the idea was to, so as you can see here, I've used the same image that I've used in some of these posters here, so that there's kind of visual consistency. Again, it talks about vaccines, information about vaccines, plainly, simply, and accurately. And then what I found was that while there are a lot of websites providing really fantastic information, the information is very heavy in terms of the text. It's very difficult for us to process. And I think as human beings, we tend to be more visual, and we prefer visual communication. So here's how I've kind of translated that. So here is information for parents, and then you have it here as well. Professionals here, and resources. So keeping it to as simple as possible while providing that wealth of information. Then there is a section about the project itself and the partners, and then the footer is obviously kind of legal information as well of some of the contact information. So that is the home page. And then so when we look at for instance, information for parents, information itself is translated into a number of languages. It starts first of all with English, and you can scroll down, and basically there is a lot of information, but I tried to break it down in kind of sections by using relevant, diverse, and inclusive imagery, but also to include some of the materials that was developed, and so to answer all of these sections. So everything is on a single page, and then there are additional information that people can download. At the bottom of that, you have information in different languages that we have. So we have different kind of 5 different languages as well. So that's the information for parents. Then we have a section for the professionals. So it's for healthcare, early learning, and childcare professionals. The idea of this page is to help the professionals to learn more about the vaccines, what it means, and what they can do to understand what happens, why some people are reluctant, and then some of the things, talking points about the vaccines. So everything again is on one page. There is a lot, but it's kind of broken into a section. And then we have the footer with more information, related pages. So that is, and then in the resource section itself, it has all of this information, apart from the languages, in the expandable sections. So download or find this, learn more, and so on. So it's so that was kind of the rationale for all of this. So really, in terms of, as you can see from the colors, there isn't glaring black and white, to ensure that people with certain cognitive impairment can access this easier. There are lots of, so I wanted really to focus in terms of the accessibility for the things that cannot be changed with technology, in terms of increasing the size of the font, because while you can increase the size of the font, you can't change the type of the font. Also, the colors are something that can't be changed, and so on. And I wanted really, again, to focus on the end result, what it is that vaccines tend to do. Those are providing the protection for, and ideally providing kind of ensuring that the families remain healthy and well throughout all the stage. The children remain healthy during the older stages of their childhood. So I have final slide to show. This is the website is just being launched. There's so this is kind of overall scoring that we have at the moment. So performance, accessibility, best practice, and search engine optimization. Now this actually will be increased once it's kind of goes live properly, because it's still in a kind of sub-developer mode. But as you can see, it has a kind of very high scoring. So that is the website in a nutshell. So it's there's been a lot of kind of responsibility I felt put on design to ensure that a lot of information is presented in a kind of pleasing manner. But for me, it was really kind of very much kind of project that I was very much passionate about. And for me, as I said to Barbara and Eileen, it was a privilege for me to work on this project. So thank you for that. Not sure of how long I've talked about.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much for this. Really appreciate that. So it's about vaccines.ie. And so we just have a quick few minutes for Q&A. So if anyone has any Q&A, as Anne said there, please pop them in the box, and we'll ask a few questions too. So anyone that talked today. So I'll just give you a few minutes. I suppose just Kirsty, I might just bring you in. I suppose we've seen the website now and seen the simple design. I suppose like you obviously know a lot about media and stuff, like how important is simple language and simple design when it comes to communicating these kind of complex messages?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely important. And I think too, it fits with the whole ethos of trying to make sure that you're accessible to diverse voices too, that this isn't just targeting one specific group or leaving people out if they don't fit into the, whatever the general target audience of something is. So yeah, I think it's a really, really important resource, and it's great to have something like this too that can be shared. And I think even in cases where, maybe people are encountering misinformation online, this often happens, and people ask me, what do I do? My uncle is starting arguments on posts all the time on Facebook. Should I say something? Should I intervene? Having something like that's a useful resource that you can even just reply with and say, there's a lot of great information on this site. Just as well introduces a bit of friction in there that makes people who are maybe seeing that stop and pause and go, okay, let me investigate for myself and find out what the information is.
And I suppose tied into that, we have a question from Cara about if there's any advice for speaking to families who are anti-vaccine, and perhaps Lorraine, you might be able to have, or Kim might be able to come in on that.
I'm not specifically sure if I can advise on a particular context, but I do think in the spirit of what Katrina mentioned, framing any communication in an open way, but being very cognizant of being empathic and understanding people's motivations, and by being also honest about your stake in the conversation as well, and your position, and where you can point to those credible sources. So you may not be able to answer on the science if you're having that conversation, but you may point to the sources. And very often, I think, Kirsty, you mentioned this about the shares. So, I mean, we're seeing this proliferation of vaccine injury type kind of content. The drivers behind that might be that, we're concerned, so it's not always this bad intention, but it's about being able to point to where are the reputable sources, what is that messaging? and being able to kind of flip it. So debunk where that makes sense, or direct that conversation to professionals that can do that. And I know, Kim, you were talking about that as well, being brave to be able to frame the message in a way that is persuasive, but we also have to stand back as well and let that communication evolve. But there are points of, and I see it with the really nice graphics here on the website. Well done, that's beautiful. A lot of work here. Points of engagement and being able to disengage and re-engage as well. So being understanding it's a process of communication, not a one-time, one message, top-down approach.
Yeah, and we have another question from Laura. I might ask you, Barbara, just from your interaction with project participants, have you found that the experience with COVID vaccination has impacted on vaccination more generally? So maybe that came up during the project.
Yeah, well, because it was like at the height of, kind of when we were gathering all the information, doing focus groups, etc. It came up quite a lot, and they actually said, which was quite interesting, that they would have more faith in childhood vaccine, even though they have hesitancy and concerns and questions. They would have more faith in childhood vaccines because they've been around longer than the COVID vaccine. And I think Anthony touched on that as well when he talked earlier. But in relation to it affecting people's opinions and actually, yeah, a huge worry about novel vaccine. Like that came across. But it was important, I think it's important to say this, that they did point out that the vaccine services were still very strong within the community. And that, to me, that's one of the big positives. There was also some other great positives as well that came across. Just, things like how they actually handle vaccine conversation. I want to go back to mentioning about the way people say, how do you approach and how do you, with people and how do you debunk myths? So we do have a section which we direct people towards from the parents page to the healthcare professional page to show you how you address debunking myths, etc. If for anybody who visits the page. And one of the really important things that we need to remember here is that vaccine is a choice. And at the end of the day, when we talk about having vaccine conversations as well, if somebody asked about, a whole family being back and trying to convince, etc., I think it's important to ask permission, from people, to have that conversation. It's one of the most important things. And I know Katrina said that the outreach workers and certainly the early education workers, they don't judge and they don't get into kind of conflict with people. So there are two things that came across very strongly as well. I hope that answers your question.
Brilliant. And we just have time for one more. And Kim, you mentioned that researchers need to be encouraged to speak to the public more. And I was just wondering if there's any type of training you think would be more helpful to achieve this.
Absolutely. I mean, there are, so at universities, there are sometimes workshops and sessions where people are encouraged to learn about science communication. So there are resources out there for scientists. But I also accept that it takes a particular personality, people who are scientists but also enjoy communication and are willing to take the time to think about different ways of phrasing the same information to reach as many people as possible. But absolutely, I think kind of encouraging cross-communication between different specialisms so that we can learn from each other. It's really interesting to me learning about the psychology of how people get their information and fall into believing misinformation. And of course, it's also really important for me to understand what sort of information journalists need and how we can communicate that in clear ways without it being undermined and too bite-sized. So I certainly think that for scientists, it's not just about engaging with diverse audiences, but it's also engaging with diverse specialisms to further develop science communication as a craft.
Brilliant. And Anthony, you had a point there maybe before we finish up.
Just very briefly, I mean, debunking in some senses is the wrong way to think about it. people have various beliefs, and exploring why they hold those beliefs can be very constructive. There's a lot of work around the equal marriage referendum, of all things, where they explored at very individual level why people held particular views on who should be allowed to get married to whom, and what it was that you could do to influence those views. And most people who are opposed to vaccination or hesitant about vaccination are acting in good faith. They're acting in what they see as the best interests of themselves, their families, their children. Exploring why they see that and trying to understand what their perspective is, you may not change their view, but if you do change their view, it's likely to stick. But if you come in with you're anti-vaxxer, therefore you're an idiot and you're cowering there somewhere in the dark ages, and I'm going to bring the light of truth to your miserable, worthless existence, that is not the way to change people's minds. You change people's minds by listening to them respectfully and understanding what they're saying, understanding what their perspective is.
Brilliant, and that's a nice note to finish on, I think. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for in terms of Q&A. But the project team have told me if there are any other questions, just to let them know and they'll answer them offline. But before we sign off, I'll quickly bring Barbara back to say a few thank yous.
Thanks, Maria. So just to say, the About Vaccines website media launch will be next week, and we'll update all the networks and participants with the website link, and our hashtag is About Vaccines. So thank you to all the panelists and particularly anybody who spoke today, our project partners and Science Foundation Ireland for the funding. I would like to especially thank the parents and guardians, early learning educators and outreach workers who gave their voices to enable this project to happen. And we would also like to thank in particularly our excellent MC, Maria Delaney, Anne Kearns, Emma Clark, and the team at ADAPT for their help in managing today's events. So many thanks. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Barbara. So I'd quickly like to thank everyone who spoke as well, the project members and the participants. And finally, thanks to everyone who took the time to join us online for the launch today. Thanks very much.
Thank you.